Language learning is about more than just language learning, right? It's also about understanding an entirely different culture. And sometimes understanding a different culture means going beyond just learning how to speak and into embracing different forms of art and different ideas of how the world works. And in the case of Chinese art, you and I have a lot to learn. As you guys know, I'm a major advocate for writing Chinese characters by hand. This is why I strongly recommend incorporating Chinese character practice in your Chinese study routine, and I do it myself. Writing characters by hand will help you develop a personal relationship with the written language. But of course, there's a big gap between knowing how to write standard characters and making any sense of works like this. Yeah, it's about time that we walk together through the world of Chinese calligraphy. Now, I'm fascinated with the Chinese language, both written and spoken, and I've been interested in Chinese calligraphy ever since I started learning the language. That doesn't mean that I can actually, read the calligraphy, but at least the desire is there. Of course, you don't need to spend your time looking at cursive characters like this to appreciate the Chinese written language. However, if you are truly interested in developing a cultural understanding of the Chinese written language, you really need to start writing the characters out. There's a reason why Chinese calligraphy works attract high amounts of money at auction, and it's not just because they look cool or different or unusual. And the truth is that you really can't understand this stuff unless you at least know the stroke order of the characters, as well as all the recognized and accepted ways there are to break those rules in the works of calligraphy. Now, this video is not like your standard Chinese calligraphy video, right? I'm not going to show you like a tutorial on how to write it. I'll let the native speakers do that because they actually understand it. If I were going to teach you, it would be downvoted and, nobody would want to watch it. Now, what we're talking about here is the sort of thing that you learn about when you actually start to take the time to study this stuff. We're going to skip all the boring stuff. We're just going to go straight for the stuff that's meaningful. Take this character, for example, which even your Chinese friends will likely read incorrectly. It's easy to confuse that character with this one, which is Diao in Putonghua, or Diu in Chinese, and it's vulgar in both languages. The truth is, however, that this character is actually Hu, as in tiger. And yeah, there's an evolutionary reason why the cursive form of Hu looks so different from the standard form of the character. So if you remember the video I made a couple weeks back about the history of simplified characters in China, you'll remember that there are actually a whole bunch of different ways to write Chinese characters. There's tons of these different script styles that have come up over the years. That's right. So if you learn the standard, 3,000 to 5,000 characters to become fluent in Chinese, that's really not enough. If you really want to master the language, you need to then relearn all of those characters from scratch in the various seal type scripts, and yes, there are more than one, and then you need to learn the cursive type. Once you've mastered that, then you can finally tell your friends and family members what the calligraphy work you see in Chinese restaurants actually says. If you spend your time on useful websites like zi.tools, you'll be able to take a look at the evolution of characters like Hu over the centuries. As you can see here, the earliest variants of the character were almost all hieroglyphic in nature. In other words, it looks like a tiger. By the time you get to the seal script that was used early in the Han Dynasty, the character had already become a complete abstraction of what it originally was. And then the character Hu basically went on two different artistic tracks at the same time. So the track that became what we recognize today as standard Chinese was basically an attempt to regularize every single character into something that was like square, something that was predictable, and something that was easily legible. The other track went a little bit wild. So if you trace the development of this character over time, you will notice that kaishu, or the so-called regular script, is a lot easier to read than the older stuff. It's not hard to see how you get to the modern forms of the character that are so familiar to us. Meanwhile, the cursive style developed largely through xingshu, or running script, which people also call the semi-cursive style. A careful look at the examples on the right shows you where the cursive style came from. And here you get the cursive examples that show up so frequently in calligraphy. Now, the fun thing about Chinese calligraphy is that the characters wind up looking so radically different, especially when you get to the cursive style. It gives the characters this certain abstract feel. It looks incomprehensible to the untrained eye, but then again, you also can actually study enough to figure out how to read it. And the cool part is that learning Cao Shu form means learning the history of every one of these characters. So take the character le, or I guess you could call it yue, one that should be familiar to you, for example, right? This one means happiness when you say le. Anyway, go back to the earliest forms of the character and you will see a candelabra. Now, even the so-called running script version looks like the modern so-called traditional character. But when you get to the Cao Shu version, you will notice that it looks quite different. And yes, the modern simplified version of le comes directly from the Cao Shu shortened variation. And that's not the only simplified character with a direct precedent in Cao Shu. Now, while not all of the simplified variations are backed up by old calligraphy, quite a few are. And that adds a lot of fuel to the fire of that debate over whether simplified characters are somehow an attack on the traditional culture of China, or whether they embrace the traditional culture of China. Now, believe it or not, Chinese is not the only language where you see the massive impact of Cao Shu. About 1200 years ago or so, the Japanese would frequently use a system called manyogana to use Chinese characters to represent Japanese sounds. This particular manuscript includes both the original manyogana characters and a hiragana transcription. Now, I'm not going to dig into this too much in this short video, but if you look closely at this example comparative chart from Wikipedia, you will notice that the manyogana does contain some characters that represent the sense of the Chinese word and not just the pronunciation. And this table gives you an idea of the different characters that were frequently used to represent different words. But the problem, of course, is that written Chinese really is not a good phonetic way of transcribing things. I mean, the characters are not really fully hieroglyphic either. They're kind of a combination of the two. Like, characters sometimes have meaning based on like how the characters are drawn and formulated and their relationship to other characters, or sometimes they represent certain pronunciations based again on their relationship with other characters, right? This causes one of those totally crazy problems when you're trying to learn the language, and it really drives you nuts when you're trying to learn classical Chinese. See, the problem is not just that there's a bunch of characters you don't see anywhere else. If that were the only problem, it wouldn't be an issue because we have these things called dictionaries. No, the problem is that the authors of the older texts would frequently use certain characters with the same pronunciation, or today maybe similar pronunciation, to stand in for other characters for whatever reason, because they liked this character better than that one, or they forgot how to write that character, or something like that. It's sort of like if you read older English texts, you'll notice that there are like arbitrary spelling conventions, especially when you go back to the 18th century and earlier. Anyway, manyogana is basically like that, but it's cranked up to 11. But fortunately for us, manyogana eventually led to Japan's two dominant alphabets. For example, the standard or kaishu form of the Chinese characters led directly to the katakana that you see here. This chart probably is not that helpful for you if you're not intimately familiar with the kanji, but this does help explain why the katakana are the way that they are. But the real interesting chart is this one here. The top rows you see are the kaishu form of the characters. The bottom rows are the hiragana, and as you can see, they look totally different from those characters. But the interesting part is the Cao Shu, or the Sousho variants of the characters, which is what you see in these middle lines. Hiragana comes directly from that grass writing style. It's yet another example of how important Chinese calligraphy really is. Now, the biggest question that you're probably thinking about, if you're crazy like me, is how in the world you're supposed to actually learn how to read this kind of calligraphy. And I've got some bad news for you. The only way that you can really learn how to read it is to learn how to write it. How to write it yourself, not with your cell phone like this. No, you have to use a brush, right? And you have to learn the right way to write it. But there's good news there as well, which is that it's a lot of fun to learn how to write this, and there are tons of resources out there that can help you. You can find these Chinese calligraphy sets just about everywhere, and they really aren't all that expensive, even if it's a higher end model like this one. I really recommend learning together with your significant other, which means buying one of these double heart sets. Pick up some of these standard practice paper things from Amazon or whatever. They're really cheap, and then you're basically ready to go. But of course, you don't want to be boring and just write kaishu all the time, do you? Well, of course not, right? You want to get to the good stuff, the fun stuff. That's the reason why we're doing this, not to write boring stuff that anybody can read. Now, the way that people traditionally learned and spread the old calligraphy traditions of China's past was through a practice of making what they would call rubbings from these stones or steels that were engraved with certain calligraphy forms. So, for example, you might see an odd-looking book like this show up at your local art museum or auction gallery or something like that. Just like many other cultures, the ancient Chinese would carefully engrave texts into various steels and statues, which is one way that we know how characters have changed over time. Calligraphy is the same way, and as you can see, there are people to this day who visit museums to make rubbings of famous calligraphy works. In fact, I've been to this museum in Xi'an before. This method allowed the handwriting of the old artistic masters to survive the ages. That's something that was not always possible with their original works of art. And so if you actually want to learn the calligraphy style of the past today, the best way to do it is precisely the way that millions of people before you have already done it. You get a copy of that old handwriting, you study it, and you try to replicate it yourself. And that's right, that means you need to write it by hand yourself. And like I said, you have to use a brush, not a pen, and not your stupid finger on like the screen or whatever. In fact, you can even find English translations of some of these works, such as this excellent version of the 1,000 character classic. The text itself is fairly simple if you have even just a rudimentary knowledge of classical Chinese, but as you can see here, the way the characters are written varies widely depending upon whose text you read. Now, as you can see here, the rubbings are not exactly complete, but at least you can make most of them out. And fortunately, our English translators were kind enough to help restore some of those missing or incomplete characters for us, making this a task that is at least possible to accomplish. And that's the way you do it. It's the only way that works. You have to learn it, you have to go slowly and deliberately, and you have to study the way the characters are written, not just like what they are or what they look like, but how they are formulated. And then once you've done that with one of these earlier texts, then you have to move on to a later text that might be a little bit more complex. Eventually, you'll get to the point where you can graduate to slightly more difficult texts. These characters are still readable at least. Over time, and with some practice, you can start going after more difficult texts like this one. And of course, if you're serious, it's worth it to invest in a good calligraphy dictionary like this one. Now, if you thought that the Chinese to Chinese dictionaries were difficult to read, you really need to check this baby out. And, take your time if you want to do this. Heck, you could probably even set Anki up to help you learn this. Just remember, though, that, one of these normal ballpoint pens like this baby, it's not going to fly. The reason why is because it's got a different type of tip to it. To be able to actually make this type of calligraphy, you have to have a brush because you have to learn how to do those certain brush strokes, right? That's the reason why it looks the way that it does, and that's the key to understanding the emotional impact of Chinese calligraphy and the way that the characters are written because of how those strokes are formulated. That's where the art is. In the end, though, the best way to really appreciate Chinese calligraphy is to do it the old-fashioned way. Some of the most famous works of all time might seem incomprehensible to you at first. However, if you put in a little bit of effort and have some patience with yourself, you will be able to learn the ways of Cao Shu in no time. And then you will finally understand what in the world is going on here. Now, in closing here, Chinese calligraphy is not like modern art where things feel really random and arbitrary. Instead, it's really the art of expressing yourself within a very specific and well-defined framework. It's very similar to the classical Chinese poetry that I love so much. The characters are still characters in the end, even if they've evolved to this highly abstract form that seems highly unusual and difficult to read for those of us who are mere mortals. But isn't that what art really is all about, right? It's all about finding the deep meaning and the deep emotion behind the ordinary things in this world. And in the case of written Chinese, it's about finding the true art and the true beauty behind ordinary characters.